Within the fossilized sepulchre of a dead god, signal linguist Kaelen sought oblivion. The profound silence inside the colossal ribs of the mining rig, nicknamed the Carcass, was a sanctuary from the transmission that had broken his career and his spirit. In the central processing hub, holographic displays of mineral yields flickered against the ancient bone. Crew Chief Mara addressed the bone harvesters, her voice sharp and devoid of sentiment. Quotas were slipping, and the exotic crystalline structures within the fossil were too valuable for delays. Kaelen remained at the periphery, monitoring the rig's structural integrity, his presence a functional necessity and nothing more. He was an instrument, and that suited him. Isolation was the only penance he had left to offer. Later, at his listening post deep within the leviathan's immense skull, Kaelen's sensors registered a faint resonance. For a moment he saw a pattern, a ghost of a signal in the structural stress readings, but he forced it from his mind. It was an echo of his failure on Cygnus X1, where his misinterpretation of a distress call as simple stellar radiation had cost an entire research outpost their lives. He would not make that mistake again. He would not hear patterns where there were none. Restless sleep eventually claimed him in his sterile quarters. There he did not dream of his past, but of a future he had never known. He floated, disembodied, above a majestic alien metropolis of crystalline spires that drank the soft, pale light of a dead white star. A feeling of profound peace washed over him, a sense of belonging so absolute it was alien to his very soul. For the first time in years he felt he was home. The next cycle, in the mess hall, the illusion of solitude shattered. Kaelen overheard two roughnecks speaking in hushed, confused tones. One described a city of glass towers, another, the ghostly light of a dying sun. As he listened, a cold dread began to form in his gut. They were not describing a shared fantasy or a folk tale from some forgotten colony. They were describing his dream, his sanctuary, with an impossible and terrifying precision that defied all logic. The silence he had sought was beginning to scream. By the next rotation, the whispers in the mess hall had grown into a chorus of unease that echoed through the main excavation cavern. Drills fell silent as crews gathered in small, anxious groups, their hushed conversation centered on a city under a dead star. Productivity plummeted. Crew Chief Mara, her face a mask of impatience, strode into the cavern. Her voice, amplified by the rig's comms, cut through the murmurs. She declared the shared dream a textbook case of mass hysteria, a psychological consequence of deep space isolation. The dream was a fiction, the work was not. That night, the dream returned, and it was no longer a fiction. Every soul aboard the Carcass was once again suspended above the silent, crystalline metropolis. The serene vision, however, was now corrupted. A new element had been introduced, a subtle, pervasive hum. It was a sound felt more than heard, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate not from the city, but from the black sky above the ghostly white star. The sense of peace was replaced by a profound and inexplicable unease, a feeling that they were being observed by something ancient and patient, and that the city was not a sanctuary, but a tomb. The waking world offered no respite. Across the rig, crew members reported identical, disturbing symptoms to the medical bay. They spoke of phantom vibrations resonating deep within their bones, and a persistent, low-level hum that lingered in their ears, an echo of the dream's ominous soundtrack. The medical officer, a man of empirical science, was confounded. Diagnostic scans revealed perfectly healthy subjects, yet the distress was palpable. The horror had begun its migration from the realm of sleep into the physical reality of the crew. In the solitude of his listening post, Kaelen saw not chaos, but a pattern. He cross-referenced the crew's descriptions of the hum with the phantom vibrations, mapping them as one might map a signal. On his spectrograph, the noise from the dream resolved into a waveform of stunning complexity, too structured to be random. It was a language. A horrifying realization coalesced in his mind. The fossilized bones of the leviathan were not inert. They were a psychic resonator, a biological hard drive broadcasting a stored memory into the minds of the nearest sentient beings. They were not dreaming. They were receiving a message. Kaelen took his findings to Mara's command office. He presented the data on her main screen, the complex waveforms stark against the rig's schematics. He explained his theory with quiet urgency. They were interfacing with the Leviathan's dying memory. Mara listened with a tightening jaw, her eyes fixed not on the data but on Kaelen himself. She scoffed, accusing him of using his esoteric skills to incite panic and exploit the crew's hysteria. His contract, she reminded him, was for monitoring structural integrity, not for ghost hunting. He was ordered to cease his investigation immediately. The subsequent sleep cycle brought a fundamental and terrifying shift. The crew of the Carcass did not dream of floating above the crystalline city. Instead, they experienced it from within a single unified consciousness. They were no longer observers. They were the observed. With an immense, non-human perspective, they soared between silent spires, feeling a profound and ancient love for the metropolis below. It was a borrowed emotion, an ownership of a home they had never known, overwhelming their own memories with its sheer scale and alien sense of belonging. This new, intimate perspective began to contaminate their waking hours. The psychological integrity of the crew showed signs of rapid deterioration. A technician, tasked with calibrating mining lasers, would stare blankly at a bulkhead, his finger tracing the patterns of unknown constellations. Engineers were found humming the low-frequency signal from the dream, their voices combining in a dissonant, unintentional chorus. In the mess hall, another sketched the impossible architecture of the dream city on a datapad, her eyes distant. A shared identity, utterly separate from their humanity, was beginning to coalesce within the confines of the rig, a parasitic consciousness taking root in the minds of its hosts. In her command office, Mara reviewed the cascading productivity alerts, her jaw tight. The numbers were in freefall, but the data could not quantify the unnerving quiet that had settled over the crew. As she stared at the red lines on her monitor, she felt it again, the phantom hum vibrating deep within her skull. An involuntary shudder ran through her, a tremor of pure, animal fear. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white, forcing the sensation down. A flicker of terror crossed her eyes before it was replaced by a mask of cold fury, a doubling down on a denial that was becoming increasingly fragile. From his listening post, Kaelen documented the changes with grim focus. He noted the subtle synchronization of the crew's speech patterns, the shared tics and gestures that had appeared overnight. It was more than a shared dream. It was a linguistic infection. According to his logs, they were not merely replaying a memory. They were actively integrating the Leviathan's consciousness, its very language becoming the new operating system for their minds. The dream was a bridge, and they were all being pulled across it, leaving their individuality behind. In the next shared dream, the profound peace of the Leviathan's memory was shattered. The singular consciousness they now inhabited felt a spike of pure, primal terror that transcended any human emotion. It was the fear of a god for its devil. From the void between the stars, it sensed an approach, something vast, predatory, and impossibly ancient. The light of the dead white star, which had illuminated their shared dreamscape, seemed to dim, as if consumed by a great and silent shadow that was not yet visible, but was felt in every fiber of their borrowed being. An unseen presence loomed just beyond perception, a hunter in the cosmic dark. The terror in the dream found its release in the physical world. In every bunk, in every sleeping quarter across the Carcass, every single member of the crew awoke at the exact same instant. From over 100 throats, a single synchronized scream erupted, a perfect unison of terror that had no terrestrial origin. The sound echoed through the metallic corridors, a multifaceted cry of a single, tormented mind. It was not the sound of a nightmare but of a memory, a final, horrifying moment of a life lived on a scale they could not comprehend, now replayed through their own flesh. In the wake of the collective scream, the fragile hierarchy of the Carcass disintegrated. The mess hall became a gallery of shock, its occupants huddled in silent, trembling groups, many refusing to return to their posts. Mara's authority, once absolute, had evaporated into the recycled air. She stood alone in the center of the room and tried to issue orders, but her voice, for the first time, was thin and brittle, betraying a tremor that no amount of professional discipline could conceal. She was no longer their commander. She was merely one of the haunted. Hours later, a humbled Mara appeared at the threshold of Kaelen's listening post. The cramped station, filled with the glow of data streams, seemed to shrink her imposing figure. Stripped of her certitude, she looked small, lost. She did not waste time on apologies or recriminations. The shared terror had rendered such things meaningless. With a desperate quietness, she admitted he had been right, and asked him what the signal meant, what the dream truly was. In a final act of surrender, she offered him unrestricted access to the rig's entire sensory and communication network, placing the fate of the crew in the hands of the man she had dismissed. Granted full control, Kaelen focused the rig's deep-range sensors inward, analyzing the resonant frequencies of the memory now poisoning them. He isolated the spike of pure terror that had shattered their sleep, mapping its complex structure. His discovery was a chilling paradigm shift. The dread was not a passive emotional echo. It was a coherent, structured waveform, a targeted psychic broadcast. The Leviathan's hunter had no need for ships or kinetic weapons. It was a being that had weaponized fear itself, a predator that killed not the body, but the very concept of consciousness. As Kaelen worked, he began to notice a change in the physical world. Walking the dimly lit corridors, he observed a subtle phosphorescent sheen on the skin of his fellow crew members, a faint internal light that seemed to pulse in time with the rig's low hum. It clung to them like a film of alien starlight. Pausing before a reflective bulkhead, he saw with a quiet sinking dread that the same pale bioluminescent glow had begun to emanate from his own skin, a sign that the dream was no longer confined to their minds. That night, the dream returned with a terrifying new clarity. The crew, as the single consciousness of the Leviathan, was no longer watching a memory of peace, but experiencing the beginning of its end. They felt the creature's immense body flee through swirling nebulae and fields of nascent stars, propelled by a primal instinctual terror that had festered for millennia. The hunter was not seen, but its presence was absolute, a relentless, pursuing void that warped the fabric of spacetime around it. As it passed, the distant lights of ancient stars seemed to gutter and die, extinguished by its mere proximity. This shared experience began to manifest in their waking hours. In the main excavation cavern, the crew, moving with an eerie, unspoken synchronicity, began to shut down the mining equipment. The roar of drills and cutters fell silent, replaced by a profound quiet. Then, as one, they approached the colossal, fossilized ribs that formed their world. They reached out, their now glowing hands pressing against the ancient bone with a strange, somber reverence, as if trying to soothe the lingering pain of a wound 1,000,000 years old. In the chaotic nexus of the listening post, now a de facto command center for a crew lost to a shared nightmare, Kaelen found a terrible clarity. With full access to the rig's geological scanners, he projected a holographic model of the Leviathan's bone structure. It was not mere fossil, it was a crystalline lattice of unimaginable complexity. He realized then that the creature's consciousness had not been housed in a single brain but was distributed throughout its entire colossal frame, encoded in the very minerals they had been harvesting. The mining process, the violent fracturing of its bones, had not been desecration. It had been an awakening of its final, dying memory, and the crew were now the unwilling vessels through which this ancient trauma was forced to replay. The dream resumed. The desperate flight through the cosmos had ended. The great consciousness they now inhabited was cornered, trapped within the suffocating dust of a dead nebula. And then they saw it. The hunter appeared. It was not a creature of matter but a subtraction from it, a geometric void that tore a hole in reality. It possessed a complex, shifting, fractal shape that absorbed all light, a patch of perfect blackness against which the distant stars seemed to bend and break. It was a wound in the fabric of space, an entity of non-existence whose very presence was a declaration that life, light, and thought were temporary aberrations in an otherwise silent, empty universe. On the rig's observation deck, Mara stood before the great window, a silent sentinel looking out into the void. The faint phosphorescent glow of her skin painted a ghostly portrait against the glass. Kaelen found her there, two small, luminous figures dwarfed by the immense blackness. She did not turn. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of all its former authority, replaced by a profound and somber acceptance. "I see it now," she whispered. It wasn't just an animal. It was a world, a civilization of one. "We weren't mining a resource, Kaelen. We were cracking open a soul. The remorse in her voice was as vast and as empty as the space before them. In the main cavern, the last vestiges of individuality had been erased. The crew of the Carcass now moved with an unnatural synchronicity, their separate bodies orchestrated by a single, ancient impulse. When they spoke, it was not with dozens of voices, but with one, a strange, monotone chorus that echoed unnervingly through the cathedral of ribs. They arranged themselves in bizarre, symmetrical patterns upon the cavern floor, no longer human minors, but living fragments of a dead god's memory, performing the final, sorrowful rites for a life that was not their own. The dream shifted, granting them a final reprieve. It was a montage of a life lived across eons. The crew, as the Leviathan, experienced this silent drift through nascent galaxies, witnessing the birth of stars as slow, beautiful explosions of color. They felt the profound, lonely peace of watching primitive life take its first steps on 1,000 unnamed worlds. A silent, unseen guardian of cosmic creation. For 1,000,000 years, it had known only the quiet hum of existence, a serene and solitary journey through the endless night. This glimpse of what was lost, of a peace so absolute, only served to sharpen the terror of its imminent, violent end. Back in his post, Kaelen stared at the final segments of the memory signal, displayed as a waveform on his monitor. The hope he had harbored for a way to interrupt the sequence, to save them, evaporated. The signal was not a live transmission. It was a recording, a closed loop with a defined beginning and a violent, unalterable end. He saw it in the stark architecture of the data, a final, catastrophic energy spike from which there was no recovery. They were not merely watching a memory. They were strapped in for the final, lethal impact, destined to experience the death of a god from the inside. The hunter unleashed its weapon. It was not an energy beam or a projectile, but a signal. A song of pure dread broadcast directly into the Leviathan's mind. The crew felt it as a psychic pressure that buckled the foundations of their borrowed consciousness. The beautiful, crystalline city of the dream began to crack, its spires turning to dust. Memories not their own were unraveled, hope was inverted into terror, and the very concept of self began to fray. The Leviathan's ancient, powerful mind, a mind that had witnessed the dawn of galaxies, was beginning to fracture and disintegrate under the sheer weaponized malevolence of the void. The psychic assault within the dreamscape manifested with brutal physicality inside the Carcass. As the Leviathan's mind was torn apart, so too were the bodies of the crew. Throughout the main cavern, their forms began to convulse in violent, synchronized spasms. The faint bioluminescence that had coated their skin now flared with blinding intensity, casting the Cathedral of Ribs in a strobing, otherworldly light. Dust rained down from the colossal bones as the entire fossil began to vibrate, resonating with the agony of its own replayed death. A deep, mournful hum filled the air, a sound that was not merely heard but felt in the chest, a bass note of cosmic suffering that drowned out the pained cries of the crew. Amidst the storm of shared agony, one consciousness found a sliver of impossible lucidity. Kaelen, the signal linguist, was momentarily cast out from the hive mind. He was a single point of awareness in an ocean of screaming darkness, his identity asserting itself against the overwhelming psychic pressure. He was separate, aware and witnessing the end. In this fleeting moment of clarity, suspended between the dream and the dying, he understood that the memory could not be stopped. But he realized, with the desperate resolve of a condemned man, that he could still use his skills one last time. Fighting for control of a body that was no longer entirely his own, Kaelen stumbled through the flickering chaos towards his listening post. Every muscle screamed in protest, a puppet resisting its strings. His plan was one of desperate ingenuity, born from a lifetime of listening to the void. He would not, could not, stop the memory. Instead, he would give it a voice. His trembling, glowing hands flew across the console, rerouting the rig's primary communications array. He wasn't trying to send an SOS. He was engineering a conduit. He would turn the Leviathan's death, the entirety of its final terrifying experience, into a broadcast, a ghost signal, a warning for any ship, any species, that might one day encounter the hunter. In the dream, the final moment arrived. the fractal void that was the hunter descended upon the leviathan's consciousness. There was no impact, no sound of destruction, only a final, absolute wave of psychic annihilation. It was a targeted erasure of being, a force that unmade thought and extinguished an eon of existence like a flame. For the crew, united in this one mind, the crystalline city shattered into nothingness. They experienced a single shared moment of perfect, terrifying emptiness, the feeling of a god being switched off. The universe within their minds went from chaotic terror to absolute, silent, and eternal black. At the exact instant a dream consciousness was extinguished, a massive psychic pulse, the death echo of the Leviathan, was released from the crystalline structure of its bones. The entire rig flared with an impossible light. With his final, convulsive act, Kaelen slammed his hand down on the activation key. The pulse, a wave of pure memory and terror, was channeled through the systems he had aligned and focused into the deep space transmitter. A visible wave of energy shot from the communications array into the void. In the cavern, the crew fell silent and utterly still, their violet light fading to a dull, final ember before extinguishing completely. The rig was silent once more, a profound quiet that was deeper and more permanent than the one Kaelen had originally sought. The bodies of the crew, including the crew chief Mara and the linguist himself, lay lifeless across the rig. They were arranged in postures of strange reverence, their mission to harvest the bone having been completed in a gruesome and unforeseen manner. All machinery was still. All life was gone. The only thing active was the transmitter, its power light blinking rhythmically as it began to broadcast its terrible warning on a repeating, unending loop into the dark. Weeks after the Carcass fell silent, a corporate recovery team breached its airlock. The rig was cold, still, and unnervingly pristine. Figures in sterile environment suits moved through the bone-white corridors, their helmet lights cutting through the gloom. They found the crew in the main excavation cavern, arranged in a state of placid repose. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, no environmental failure. Each member, from the crew chief to the lowest grade technician, was simply gone. The final report, a document of clinical brevity, recorded the cause of death for all 73 personnel as simultaneous and inexplicable cerebral cessation. They had died as one, their minds extinguished in the same silent instant. The rig's only sign of life was its deep space transmitter, broadcasting a powerful repeating signal. The recording was immediately classified and sent to the corporation's top xenolinguists and signal analysts. For months they labored to find a pattern, a language, a meaning within the complex waveform. They found none. The signal resisted all attempts at decryption, yet it possessed a quantifiable effect. Test subjects exposed to the broadcast reported severe psychological distress, vivid nightmares of impossible geometries, and a pervasive sense of existential dread. The project was abruptly terminated, and the signal was officially designated a memetic hazard of unknown origin. In response to the inexplicable events and the hazardous signal, the Interstellar Commerce Authority acted with unprecedented swiftness. Sector 734, the volume of space containing the fossilized Leviathan, was declared a permanent quarantine zone. A fleet of military vessels established an exclusion perimeter, deploying a network of sentinel drones and gravimetric barriers that rendered the area impassable. The official directive cited a risk of unstable exotic radiation emanating from unique fossilized mineral deposits. It was a plausible and sufficient lie, a bureaucratic veil drawn over a truth that no one understood and no government was willing to confront. Behind the energy wall, the Carcass and its silent crew were left to the darkness, a tombstone orbiting a tomb. Despite the official quarantine and the corporate silence, stories began to circulate on the fringes of the galactic network. Among deep space miners, asteroid prospectors, and signal hackers, the official report was dismissed. They spoke of a ghost rig, a crew that had drilled too deep into something that should have remained asleep. The legend of the Nightmare Rig became a cautionary tale, a modern myth whispered in the dimly lit bars of remote outposts. It was a warning about the void's oldest truth, that not all silence is empty. Far from human space, in a system orbiting a dying star, an array of crystalline receivers intercepted the broadcast. The alien listeners, beings of silicon and light, analyzed the signal. There was no need for decryption. They recognized the signature instantly, for it was imprinted in their oldest ancestral records. A wave of communal terror, a concept akin to religious fear, pulsed through their network. It was the death scream of a star singer, a leviathan, an event not witnessed for millennia. And embedded within it was the unmistakable mimetic signature of the hunter, the ancient enemy they knew only as the static that thinks. The warning had been heard. The fate of the crew aboard the Carcass serves as a somber meditation on the cost of knowledge. They journeyed into the void seeking mineral wealth, a tangible and finite resource. Instead, they unearthed a truth their consciousness was not built to contain. Humanity had long looked to the stars and wondered if it was alone. The crew of the Carcass found the answer. They learned that the universe holds predators for which even gods can be prey, and that some discoveries are not revelations but endings. Their minds, unprepared for such a scale of existence, became the final, broken vessel for a story never meant for them. In the years that followed the quarantine, a strange phenomenon was observed within the Forbidden Sector. The latent psychic energy, imprinted upon the very structure of the Leviathan's remains, began to bleed out into the void. The colossal bones, once dark and inert, started to emit a faint, constant, silver-blue light. From a distance, for any ship that dared to skirt the quarantine buoys, the fossilized skeleton no longer appeared as a tomb, but as a new and hauntingly beautiful constellation against the unending black. For Kaelen, the signal linguist who sought only silence, the end was a tragic form of redemption. The professional failure that had haunted him, the misinterpreted signal that led to disaster, was the very trauma that prepared him for this final moment. It had taught him the weight of a message unheard. His last act was not one of desperation, but of perfect, terrible clarity. It was the ultimate communication, a warning sent from one mind that had finally understood another across an impossible gulf of time and biology. A final message from one linguist to any other who might be listening. The incident raises a chilling question that echoes in the quiet dread of deep space travel. If the death of one such being could leave behind a ghost of such power, what other memories, what other final broadcasts from long-dead things might be adrift in the static between worlds? It suggests that every silent, unexplored corner of the universe might be haunted by warnings just like this one, each a final scream of a forgotten entity waiting patiently for a receiver to tune in. The quarantine remains absolute. The official reports are sealed. But the signal has never stopped. From the heart of that celestial graveyard, the rig's transmitter continues to broadcast. It is a ghost in the static, a tombstone and a lighthouse, broadcasting its shared nightmare into the unending dark, a final, eternal testament to the crew of the Carcass and the god they died with.